So how do you take a simple project from drab to fab? Inlay, baby, inlay. Now just about any project can be kicked up a few notches by adding some sort of a decorative inlay. This shaker table is beautiful, very elegantly designed. It's a classic design that looks great, but you know, it's a simple cherry table and I think it could really use a little bit of an adornment on the top. So a freehand router inlay is a great way to do that. So I'm thinking about putting a very simple leaf design toward one of the corners just to kick it up a notch. So that's pretty much what we're going to focus on today, is the process of doing that. First, I'd like to take a little trip down memory lane and show you one of my very early projects that I made for Nicole that I did my first inlay on. Let's check it out. All right, so here it is, never before seen. I don't think I've shown any pictures of this to anybody. I've never posted any information about this project because it was pretty early in my woodworking career that I made this for Nicole. Very simple jewelry box, 2 doors on the front that open to reveal a set of drawers on the inside. The drawers, this was actually Nicole's idea to come up with a design that's repeated only twice, even though there's 4 drawers. So the 2 drawers together make the circular design, but each drawer has a half circle on it. Let's see, dovetailed on the sides, simple wooden runners. Really nothing too tricky as far as this stuff goes. Knife hinges, first time I ever installed those, and it came out pretty nice. Now, the inspiration, other than Nicole, the inspiration for this project was the inlay on the front. I had taken a class with David Marks. In fact, it was the first time that I had met David beyond meeting him at a show. And I took a class with him on inlay, which, by the way, he still does teach that class in his shop in Santa Rosa. So I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested and you're in the Northern California area. I highly recommend you take it. He does a marquetry and router-based inlay class that's fantastic. So that was the class that I took with him. As part of the class, I basically built this little leaf here in the front, and you can see on the other door here is where I practiced the first time. So I came home with this little practice board with this really nicely figured maple on the front and my practice inlay, and I figured, you know what, I want to do something with this. I don't know what to do, but I want to do something. Well, I figured, let me cut that piece, my practice board, in half. I can make 2 doors. And then the idea just came to me, maybe I should build a jewelry box out of this. And since this inlay was so representative of my path as a woodworker just starting, I thought it would be great to build something for Nicole that kind of captures the essence of that time in my life. So here's the project. Now, in true woodworker fashion, before I go into detail on this inlay, I want to show you all the flaws, because that's always fun. First of all, in the back here, you can see the, the biscuit that I cut through. Apparently, see, that's what happens when you don't pay attention to where you place your biscuits on a glue up like this. So the biscuit is showing here. Now, because this was originally intended to be a prototype for a design, which I did make a second version of this that came out quite a bit nicer, but just doesn't have the story to it. Look at what I did with the top here. So that's one of the major flaws. The other thing is, of course, these doors are now not closing all the way. I think maybe a little bit of expansion, maybe my hinges weren't installed properly, but that actually, I could probably fix that if I really wanted to. And of course, you know, I was very new to dovetails and a dovetail jig, so there's a few gaps here, but when you have such a dark wood combined with such a lighter color wood, those gaps are much less noticeable. So that's a nice little trick if you're early in your woodworking career and you want things to look nicer than they really do. Combine dark and light woods. Works miracles. So the inlay itself consists of about 7 pieces of material. There's 2 pieces for each leaf, and the stem is constructed of 3 separate pieces. I believe the stem was Wengi, and if I'm not mistaken, this was olive wood. I can't 100% remember that, but I'm pretty sure. And really the process of creating this inlay is a matter of understanding which pieces get put in first, because each one of these pieces is placed in separately. So you have to determine what the order of that placement is in order to get the design to look the way you want it to look. So we're going to do something very similar to this today, just a very nice, simple inlay that we You don't want to overcomplicate it at first. You want to keep it simple to ensure success, and you could always build upon it as time goes on, and your next inlay can be that much more complex. So let's dig right into it. So to create decorative inlay, to put it in the simplest terms possible, all you really need to do is cut a particular shape out in some sort of figured wood or whatever wood you want it to be made out of. You can see I've got quite a collection here of different things. I cut these to about 1/8 of an inch thick, maybe a little bit less. You cut your image out in this material, and then you route the substrate, your tabletop or whatever it is that you want to put that inlay into. You route the recess and you pop that piece in. So we'll get into the entire process, but really it starts with a drawing. So you could have, I've got a bunch of different books with artwork in it, with natural pictures of leaves and trees and things like that, and I use those to get my basic images. And I'm not that great of an artist. I can't draw things, to save my life. So I like to really copy images that I see. I've even gone to the extent of finding a picture on the web, taking a piece of tracing paper and putting it up on my monitor to get a basic shape of a flower. In fact, that's what I did with my inlaid hall table. I had this really interesting picture of a flower here that I wasn't really sure how to draw freehand, so I just took it right off of the screen. Okay, so that's the idea. You need to start with a picture, but keep in mind it has to be relatively simple, because with this type of inlay, you don't really have the ability to get too detailed. We're limited by the size of our router bits, and the smallest router bit I have is about 1/16 of an inch, so you can't get all that much detail, and you don't have nearly as much control as you do with something like, let's say, marquetry. So what you have to do is let the wood speak for itself. Let the wood's grain be what really jazzes this thing up and takes it to the next level. So picking the type of material to use in your project is absolutely crucial to your success. So once you have your master picture, and whether that is the book itself, a book that has a photograph in it or something, or you've drawn something on a piece of paper for yourself, you want to create what you're going to call your master tracing. So get a piece of tracing paper and take your original design and then make sure you get a nice accurate tracing of that picture. Okay? And this is what we're going to use to transfer these designs to our workpiece. Now you can see what I've got here is a very simple leaf design, and that's the one that we're going to use for this project. Now this is a leaf and stem design that I used on, well, in fact I used it on the second version of that jewelry box that I made, which was actually for a customer. So things are a little bit more refined, a little bit cleaner. You'll notice the design really is very simple. It consists of a stem and 2 leaves. Each leaf is consisting of basically 2 pieces. And what we need to do right now is determine how these pieces overlap, because whatever is in the background has to be inlaid first, and then everything else gets inlaid on top of it. So you can see this leaf here is in the background, but this leaf is in the foreground. So this one has to go in first, and then we'll put this one on top of it. The stem can go, well, it's up to you. The stem can go first, it can go last, depending on how you want the stem to work into these pieces of the leaf material, but that's kind of flexible as far as I'm concerned. So now we know this piece needs to go in first. So what I like to do is label each piece of wood with a number that tells me which one is going to go first. So I'm going to start on the outside here. That's piece number 1. It's piece number 2, piece number 3, and piece number 4. So we'll start by doing this little moon-shaped piece here. We'll drop this guy right on top of it, then we'll come in with this piece 3rd, this piece 4th, and again, the stem can either actually be number 1 or number 5 in this case. Now I think what I'd like to see is the inlay somewhere in the bottom right corner, toward the front of the table, and right there looks pretty good. So what I want to do is create reference marks, because you're going to have to transfer the design to the table a couple different times. So it's nice to have reference marks outside of the drawing that will help you place this in the proper location later. So I'm going to start by taping the corner here with some blue tape. It doesn't really need to be anything more than that. I just want to make sure that the piece goes back in the same position after I put the carbon paper on here. Now, carbon paper, believe it or not, yes, they still make it. You might get some funny looks when you go into a store and ask for it though. So put some carbon paper under your tracing, and we're going to use that to transfer the image. So nothing tricky here. Just start going around. Okay, and now here's the reason for those reference marks. I'm going to transfer those to the workpiece as well, because I can't work with this piece of paper here. I'm going to have to take this paper off. So the next time I need to put the paper back to trace my drawing on again, I now have these marks here that show me exactly where this piece goes, and then I can tape it back down and put the image back in place. So now we're going to take our tracing and we're going to use our inlay material and draw these individual shapes onto the inlay material. But before we do that, it's important to understand this concept of overlapping. Wherever the pieces overlap, we have to sort of be careful with how we put them together. You see the seam right here in the middle? If I just cut this piece perfectly to this shape, and then this piece perfectly to this shape, we are making a lot of extra work for ourselves and hoping that this seam is going to be nice and tight between these two pieces. So we have an advantage that we're putting these things in one piece at a time. So what I'm going to do is this first piece that goes in, where the side that it meets another piece is actually going to get cut just a little bit oversized, so that I can put that piece in, flush everything down, and then come with the next piece and put it over top. That second piece will then overlap some of that material that we put in that first piece and give us a nice tight seam between these two pieces. Again, it will make a lot more sense as we move forward, so if that's a little bit confusing right now, don't worry about it, but just understand that I'll be cutting my pieces slightly oversized on the side where they meet another piece. Now before I assign pieces of wood to each of these individual leaf parts, I want to draw in some lines that will sort of give me an idea of what the grain direction should be, because this is a leaf, right? So if this were a natural leaf, the grain direction would go at sort of a 45-degree angle to the center part of the leaf here, the vein, or where the two halves meet. So it's important to get these on there because they're going to serve as reference points. And one of the great things about using tracing paper is the fact that you can see through it. You can see I've already cut some leaf parts out of this piece, and you can move it around until that grain matches up just where you want it to. So here's a piece of zebra wood. That's a great leaf material. This is a piece of, I believe this is canary wood. Okay, that's another great piece for these nice veins that would be great for a leaf. And if you want to do something more subtle, of course, you've got things like walnut. You want to be a little bit more loud. You've got stuff like padauk here, some mahogany to be a little bit more reserved. I think I'm going to go with probably the zebra wood. Oh, I don't know. That's a tough choice. This cherry is going to get darker over time, and I think the zebra wood is going to stand out a little bit more. The cherry will probably get closer in color to this piece of canary wood, and it'll make this a little bit less noticeable. So I think I'll stick with the zebra wood for this one. So I'm only worried about piece number 1 right now. So I'm going to take this to the wood, and I'm just going to move it around. You can see the grain in the zebra wood is vertical here. So I'm going to turn it until it matches up. Okay, that's not too bad. Now you can see I've got this dark streak. If you think somewhere in this leaf there would naturally be something dark, maybe here at the base, maybe even here at the tip you would have a dark spot, along this line in the center, you could use this piece to sort of paint that leaf on whatever way you think it should be done. So for me, I think I'm going to let some of that darker color come into the bottom of my leaf here. So just to keep things from moving around, a little piece of tape. So I just insert the carbon paper. Trace leaf number 1. Now remember, I mentioned the overlap. If I cut this piece directly to this line and then try to match my other piece up directly to that line, that's going to be very difficult to do. So I do want to overlap. So instead of cutting directly to my line, I'm oversizing this piece by just a little bit. And it doesn't really matter. I can freehand that because the second piece is going to come in and overlap right on top of that. So if this edge is a little wacky, it's not that big of a deal. Now, without a doubt, the best tool for getting these pieces cut out is a scroll saw. Now, unfortunately, with my smaller shop setup, the scroll saw is in storage right now, so I could go get it, but I think I can accomplish these cuts using my bandsaw and a 1/4-inch blade. But you just want to make sure that you don't get too close with your fingers and you have a nice controlled cut. The thing is, if you get more complex with your design and those pieces get skinnier and skinnier, you're absolutely going to have to use a scroll saw to do it. Or if you want to do it by hand, a fret saw or coping saw will get the job done too. But for these pieces, they're pretty big and there's not really any intricate curves that we have to worry about. I should be able to do it with the bandsaw. Now, if the surface is a little bit ratty, don't even think twice about it. Just use a little bit of sandpaper and just kind of smooth it out a little bit. Okay, it's not absolutely critical that this be a perfect curve because this is supposed to be a leaf, right? So if it's a little bit off, that's okay. What you don't want is a bunch of cut ridges and mill marks from your saw. So that's why it's important if you do use something like the bandsaw, like I did, that you get rid of all the little frayed edges and you smooth that curve out a little bit. And one way to do that is with the sandpaper like this. Just kind of roll it across. So now we need to attach our inlay piece to the substrate itself in the right location. And we're going to use double stick tape to do it. Now the stuff, you guys hear me talk about this a lot. This is sold as Turner's tape, and I found it at Woodcraft and Rockler, both under that name, Turner's tape. So it's very thin and incredibly sticky, so it's great for something like this. So I'm basically just going to take a small piece of Turner's tape, but one that's big enough to cover the full length of the piece, and attach the double stick tape. A little finger pressure is really all you need. And now I'm just going to use an X-Acto knife to trace around the piece of inlay, because I really want to cut away all that excess tape. This will give us a nice custom-sized piece of double stick tape here. All right, so now I just peel off the, well, I use my fingernail to make sure it's firmly attached to the back of the inlay. You don't want that to come off. And peel off the paper backing. Okay, and now I can drop it in place, and I'm going to align it with the outside of the leaf. Not too worried about the inside. Okay, that's pretty good. Now this isn't going anywhere, and this is good, because what we need to do is take a very, very sharp, brand new X-Acto knife, and we're going to trace around the outside of this piece. And I usually start by taking nice, light scoring cuts. Just lightly sever the grain. So if you push too hard at first, you could trail off in some unusual direction that would really, really mess things up. So take your time, and once that groove is established, you could start to press down a little bit harder. Now I am trying to keep my blade close to vertical here. I may give it a slight angle, but I'm trying to stay as close to vertical as I can. So just take your time and trace around. Patience pays off here. These corners are probably the trickiest part, so I just take a series of small little cuts like this as I work my way around the corner until they all connect. And once you're pretty confident that you've got a nice tracing all the way around the perimeter, you really only get one shot at this, so make sure it's good. Take a nice thin putty knife and just very carefully, very patiently start to wiggle the knife underneath. You do not want to crack this, and especially in these areas here where the grain is running this way and you've got these little tiny pieces, it's incredibly easy to split that. But you can see it doesn't take a whole lot to loosen it up. Just take your time again. Inlay is not a sport for the impatient. Now, all these extra pencil lines and everything that are here can only serve to confuse you. So what I recommend doing is taking a pencil, tracing in to the groove that you've already cut with your knife. I'm going to get some pencil dust down in there. And then come back with your eraser and go across your line. Don't go with it, go across it. We're going to drive pencil shavings or pencil dust and the shavings from the eraser down into that groove. And that's going to help darken it for us. You don't have to erase the entire image. But you can see with the pencil gone, we've got a nice accurate line showing us exactly where this piece is going to go. So now we need to make a recess in the surface following our tracing line that we just made that this little piece can pop right into. Now, first thing you need to know is that the depth of that hole is actually going to be just a little bit shallower than the thickness of this workpiece. When this drops in, we want it to sit a little bit proud of the surface, and then we can use a scraper or something to smooth it all out and make it level with the rest of the surface. The other thing we need to do is consider what tool we're going to use to make that recess. For me, there is nothing better than just a standard router and a couple of straight router bits. There are other options out there. I've got one of these Fordham kits that's basically like a high-powered Dremel. You could certainly use a Dremel, and you can also use a laminate trimmer. The feedback that I've gotten from people who do this, and also my experience with these lighter tools, is that the lighter that tool is, the harder it is to keep that bit tracking the way you want it to. A really light base like this doesn't really resist the motion of the grain, so if the grain wants to pull that bit in a certain direction, it's very difficult to stop it using that tool. Now, some people have had great success with it, so I can't knock it, but for me personally, the heft and the weight of a standard full-size router is really the way to go, because then I could just grab hold of the base and move it around, and it's not going to go anywhere unless I want it to. I really have to deliberately push it in a particular direction for it to go there. Now, the secret here for using a tool like this is all in the router bits. I have two very, very small bits here. I've got one that's 1/8 of an inch, and the other is a 1/16. Now, these bits are great for this because the 1/8 inch one can hog out the bulk of the material, getting pretty close to the line, and then the 1/16 is what I'm going to use to really just kiss that surface and very carefully get to my line. So you can have two routers set up, or you can change the setup in between and switch from bit to bit, whatever you're comfortable with. But the big router is the way that we're going to go with this. All right, so we're going old school on this one. What I've got here is a very bad illustration showing essentially the groove that we've made with our X-Acto knife, okay? What you would see if you took a little cross section is that we have created somewhat of a V-groove notch all the way around the workpiece. So here's what you're looking for, and I will be using magnifying lenses to watch this as I'm doing my routing. The router bit comes along this way, and as it approaches this V-groove, the bit starts to create these little frayed edges at the top as the wood kind of tears out a little bit. It's very, very small, but they're there. So you'll see these little fuzzies as you go. Well, at this point, there's no more material here. So the fuzzies just kind of pop off. And once you see that happen, you know you are in the zone where you need to stop. Okay, as soon as those frayed edges disappear, you know you have maybe one more pass at best to remove this little bit of material of that V-groove. Okay, so we're looking for those frayed edges to disappear. Once they're gone, maybe one more slight pass. If you're being daring, you might just stop right there and call it done. But that is what I'm looking for as I'm routing. And unfortunately, my camera and setup is probably not going to be able to show you that detail, but this is a pretty good illustration of what you're looking for. So here's how I set the router depth. First of all, I plunge the whole router down until it contacts the bench like that. That's the 0 point. Then I use the workpiece itself with the plunge bar mechanism here. Okay, put it between the plunge bar and the stop and lock it down. Now what that would do is give us a recess that's exactly the thickness of our workpiece. And remember, I said I want the workpiece to stand a little bit proud, which means I need to bring this bar up just a smidgen, whatever a smidgen might be, a 32nd, a 64th. What I'm going to do is use my built-in meter here. Now this is metric, but it really doesn't matter. I'm going to bring it up maybe a millimeter, maybe a half a millimeter, not much at all. Then loosen the plunge bar, and I let it drop down to the point that it catches. That's 1 more millimeter, or half. And notice that my workpiece doesn't fit anymore, so that's perfect. So my router is all set and ready to go. My workpiece is clamped to the workbench. We want to make sure that it doesn't move at all. And you can use eye protection for this, but to be completely honest with you, I don't usually do that because the eye protection, in addition to my magnifying headset, distorts my vision too much. I can't see exactly what I'm doing. So this is one of those times that I take a little bit of a calculated risk by not having complete, solid eye protection. What I've got is this. So you do have to be careful, be very cautious with it. I'm gonna have to recommend that you do use eye protection, but you're gonna see me breaking my own recommendation because I'm not going to. But sometimes in woodworking, when you're doing these things, you can't always be as safe as you want to on paper. Sometimes for the sake of getting the better result, you do have to make a sacrifice somewhere and take a calculated risk. Just be careful, don't do anything stupid, and you should be okay. Now, this is one of those interesting times in woodworking that I arrive at sort of this Zen moment, this connection with the work that is kind of hard to describe. A lot of hand tool users have it, and they think that it's a very relaxing, almost, you're planing a board down and you get into this bit of a trance. For me, it happens when I close off outside stimulation and I'm only focused on this workpiece. And it happens because the router is loud, and what I wind up doing is throwing on some headphones. I'll even use my noise canceling headphones and put on some great music. And I just get so in the zone of what I'm doing that it's incredibly relaxing. And something like this doesn't have to be very tricky. It's got a lot of parts to the process, but it can be a relaxing and fun experience. So that's what I recommend doing. Throw on some headphones, crank up some good tunes. In fact, you know what? Cue the music. Let's get started. Now I've gone about as far as I can go up on this corner here with the router bit. So what I'm going to use is an X-Acto knife just to kind of slowly but surely chisel that corner away. If you have a fine set of chisels that'll do this, that's fine too. But sometimes these points are just a little bit too severe. So take your time, slowly but surely work your way back. So that's pretty good. Now, let's do a test fit. And I'll be honest with you, no matter how good you are likely to have to do some rework here. It's almost impossible to get this perfect on the first shot, or maybe even the second shot. So you basically get it as close as you can, try to find the areas that are the offending spots. And if you see something that looks a little tight there, just go back and try and scrape. But what you want to do is scrape on a bit of an angle this way, so you're cleaning out material from the bottom, and you're not really touching this top border line. If you touch that top border line, you will actually create gaps, and we don't want that. So if it's really, really close and you just can't figure out exactly where the offending area is, the easiest thing I find to do is to taper and start to use a little bit of sanding, maybe a file or something, and just kind of give yourself a little bit of a tapered edge there toward the bottom. And essentially what you're going to do now is create a wedge. So now at this point, this piece is almost going in. I know that if I push it anymore, it's going to wedge itself in there, and I'm not going to be able to get it out. So that is close enough. And the next thing to do is to put glue in there and pound it down with a mallet and make sure it seats perfectly all the way down. So you have an option at this point though. You could add a little bit more of visual interest in a decorative element if you just sort of burn the inside corners here using a technique called sand shading. I'll show you how that's done now. Now, sand shading is literally using playground sand or any type of sand, something nice and fine grained like this. I have it in an old pot and I put it on a hot plate, and you put the wood inside there and it actually chars the surface. So what we're trying to do is introduce a little bit of a color gradient where it gets darker toward the edge, and it's a very effective way to create a shadow line. So when two pieces of this zebra wood butt up against each other, that joint, if it's nice and tight, is relatively uninteresting. And the only thing that tells you that it is two pieces of wood is that the grain is changing direction. So imagine if where those two pieces meet in the middle, we can actually get a little color there that dissipates as it gets closer to the middle of this piece. And that's what the sand shading here does. So what you're going to need, like I said, is the hot plate, some sand in a little pot like this. You want to warm it up pretty good. Just bury it down a little bit. And you're probably going to have to play with the heat settings on this because you don't want it to burn too quickly, and you never leave this unattended. You turn your back on this thing, it's going to wind up burning on you. So if you've given it a few minutes and you come back, you don't really see anything, you may want to turn the heat up just a little bit. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now I'm just going to get a little bit of color on the other side. Not much. So I'm just going to touch this center point as low as I can just to give it a little hint of color at that far edge. And that looks pretty good. Looks a little bit drastic, but trust me, it'll clean up real nice. And don't forget, turn off your hot plate. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the treatment that we just gave this piece of wood was high, dry heat. And what's that going to do? Well, it's going to drive any last bit of moisture that was in this piece right out, and it's going to cause it to shrink a little bit. So you may find that the piece that was tight fitting before now just drops in perfectly. So what I like to do in this case, if it's a little bit too loose, I want to bring some moisture back to this workpiece because it's inaccurate. The ambient moisture that was in that piece dictated a certain size before, and by driving the moisture out, we actually made it smaller. So I just like to spray it with a little bit of water and let it sit for a couple minutes to help introduce some moisture back into it. And just make sure it dries thoroughly before you put it back in. All right, so now we just add a little bit of glue into the recess. Spread it around thoroughly, make sure you get it up on the edges there. Then we drop it in place very carefully because when it's charred like this, it becomes more brittle. So you have to be real careful with it. Pretty close. And some light taps with the dead blow will drop it down. Now this may seem a little bit odd, but what I'm going to do is sand the workpiece a little bit. Basically, I'm going to create a little sawdust slurry with some of the glue that's squeezing out. You see how it's pulling up? The sand is mixing with the glue, and it's creating a little bit of a paste toward the outside. And if you have some gaps to contend with, that's what you want. So I just take my finger and take some of this sawdust glue paste that we've created. Okay, looks terrible and messy now, but trust me, it'll look fine. So I don't have much squeeze out here to worry about. I'm just using a block with some blue tape on it. You could use some packing tape. Basically, you just want something that the glue really isn't going to grip to, and you want to make sure that the glue doesn't get to the wood, because that wouldn't be good if it stuck. Now, while the first piece dries in the clamp, we could start cutting out our second piece. So now we're tracing on number 2, that's this guy right here. And remember, number 2 is behind number 3. And you notice number 2 actually stops right here. And the line for number 3 starts, and then number 2 resumes again right there. We're going to pretend that this leaf isn't here. We need to draw at least some semblance of what that leaf would have looked like if this piece wasn't in front of it. Now, even though the line stops here, I'm going to continue across. And it comes back out and meets the bottom. Now, in a subsequent step, this little piece of material here is going to get covered by piece number 3. But that's okay. We're building layer upon layer to create that sense of depth. And you could see piece number 2 coming to life. So I'll cut this out at the bandsaw again. All right, it's been several hours now, so we can see how we did. Looks pretty good. And let's scrape it so it's nice and clean. Level it with the surface. And we'll get a real good idea of how we've done. All right, and as we start to clean it up, you can see it reveals a nice light center, a dark tip down here, a little dark area down there, and a little color on the edges. Just adds a visual interest that you simply can't get from the raw piece. Big difference there. So now to drop in piece number 2, we need to know exactly where to locate it. I suppose we could just line it up and take our best guess, but let's do it the proper way. Now we've got our index marks in a few different locations here, and this will show you exactly why we needed those in the first place. Just line up the crosshairs. Okay, and now we know we're pretty much in the exact same position we were the very first time. So come back through with our carbon paper, and let's draw on piece number 2 again. So now this piece will go right on top like so. Okay, and hopefully you can see here what we've done. You see this line right there? Now when we create this recess, we're going to have a nice crisp line that's going to join these 2 pieces. So it's the same deal as before, double stick tape. And once again, we very carefully drop this in the proper location. Now another thing I wanted to tell you before I jump into routing this second part of the leaf is this is one of the few times you will ever see me let go of the handles of the router. Once this thing starts spinning, I lock the trigger on so that it doesn't turn off by itself, and then I'll grab the base with both hands. So it's fully secure, but it's just a little bit weird the first time you do it because normally you never let go of those handles. So I plunge down, get it into position, and then the whole time I'm down like this looking at the work as I'm going through. Okay, so this is the one time we're breaking some of the rules that normally we never even think about breaking, and letting go of the handles is one of those things with the router. But in this case, this just does not give me nearly as much control as when my palms are resting on the base and on the workpiece at the same time. Now for the stem piece, you want to use a dark wood. Walnut works well, but I find that Wengi has that nice, very barky, woody look to it that looks very natural to me. So I'm just going to use this little strip of Wengi. Same exact process in terms of using the tracing paper and the carbon sheet there, but the one problem is it's going to be hard to see this because it's pencil on a brown surface. I can't show it to you on camera, it's not going to come out very well, but if you just trace it with your pencil, it's fine. And remember, if the surface is a little bit jagged, how many stems have you ever seen that are perfectly smooth? A lot of times they have those little branch outs on them and little nubs on them, so there's nothing wrong with a stem that looks a little bit jagged like that. So do the best you can, cut out the rough shape, and you should be good to go. Now, without a doubt, this is going to be the hardest one to fit. And even when you are pretty darn close, it's still going to give you some trouble in some areas. So usually what I wind up doing is taking a scraper and relieving the back end. You know, we're using sandpaper to do this just to create that little bevel like we did before. But you just don't want to go too far because you could very easily loosen the fit without realizing it. So at some point here, you may be tempted, and I certainly am, to do what is like basically a leap of faith. By putting glue in here, putting this right in position, and very carefully tapping down with a block over top. And what you're going to do is force it down into place, give it a nice tight fit. But the risk you run here is if there's any wood that's really in the way that you shouldn't have done this to, you could easily snap part of the stem. But again, that's why it's called a leap of faith. I'm pretty confident that it's going to go in with no problem, and we're going to go for it. No guts, no glory, I guess, right? But you really do want to make sure that you've relieved enough material that it will wedge itself in place and not just break. Because at this point, breakage would be pretty much disaster. Grab our block. Couple hits with a hammer. And it's in. And I do have a little bit of a gap right in here behind the stem and right in the middle there. I've got some dust in the way. There's a little hairline gap there. So what you can do for that is very similar to what we did before. A lot of variations to how you can handle these things. I'm going to create some sawdust. Make sure it's kind of packed down in that area there. And grab a little bit of thin CA glue. Drip it on the surface. Any place you think you might have a gap. So essentially, the CA glue absorbs into the wood dust and fills those holes with the appropriate color material. So just a final scraping here, just to clean off any excess glue. Make sure it's nice and flat, level with the surface. And if you want to see it really come to life, we'll hit it with a little mineral spirits. Not bad, huh? Now, I don't know if the Shakers would approve of an inlay on top of one of their tables, but I sure like it. Thanks for watching.